I was 62 years old when my own brother looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer welcome in the house our mother built. He handed me a paper bag with $40 inside and said that was more than I deserved. That evening, standing in the rain outside a gas station in Knoxville, Tennessee, I understood something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. My brother hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been poisoning me, slowly, deliberately, for nearly 4 years. But he didn't know about the storage shed I'd find at the edge of town, the one with a rusted padlock and a price tag of $12. He didn't know that shed would become the most important thing I ever touched. Not because of what it was, but because of what it taught me about the difference between surviving and actually living. Hello everyone. Welcome to our story. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Please note, this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message remains entirely true. It started on a Thursday in October. I remember because Thursdays were the days I drove to the VA clinic for my blood work. I'd been getting sicker for months, fatigue so heavy it felt like my bones were made of wet concrete, headaches that started behind my eyes and radiated down my neck until my vision blurred. My hands trembled when I tried to hold a coffee mug. The doctors kept running tests, kept frowning at results, kept telling me they couldn't quite identify what was wrong. My brother, Dennis, had moved into our mother's house 6 months after she passed. Mama left the property to both of us equally in her will. She'd been clear about that, had it notarized, had copies made, but Dennis had a way of making shared things feel like they belonged only to him. He changed the locks, he rearranged the furniture, he brought his wife, Sheila, in, and together they slowly erased every trace of our mother from the room she'd lived in for 41 years. I was living in the back bedroom, the one Mama used to call the quiet room because it faced the garden and you could hear the birds in the morning. I paid my share of the utilities from my Social Security check. I kept to myself. I didn't cause trouble, but Dennis wanted me gone. I could feel it the way you feel, weather changing before you see clouds. That Thursday, I came home from the clinic feeling worse than usual. My legs barely carried me up the front steps. When I opened the door, Dennis and Sheila were sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out between them. They had the look of people who'd rehearsed something. "Walter," Dennis said. "Sit down." I sat, not because he told me to, but because my legs weren't giving me much choice. Dennis pushed a document across the table. It was a quitclaim deed. My name was already printed on the signature line. All it needed was my mark, and the house would belong entirely to him. "This is for the best," Sheila said. She didn't look at me when she said it. "You've been sick, Walter. You can't take care of yourself, let alone contribute to a property. Dennis has been carrying the weight here. It's only fair." I stared at the paper. I stared at my brother. I thought about Mama, about how she'd split everything down the middle because she loved us both the same, even though we were different kinds of men. Dennis was the one who wore suits and talked fast and always seemed to be selling something. I was the one who'd spent 30 years as a welder, who came home with burns on my arms and metal dust in my lungs, who never learned the art of making words do tricks. "I'm not signing that," I said. Dennis leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened the way it always did before he said something cruel. "Then, you need to leave. Tonight. This is my house too, Dennis. Mama's will. Mama's dead," Dennis said. "And her will doesn't mean what you think it means. I've talked to a lawyer. There are debts, Walter. Medical bills from her last year. The property needs to cover those debts, and I'm the one handling the estate. You can sign over your share voluntarily, or I can make it happen legally. Either way, you're not staying here." I knew enough to know he was lying. Mama had insurance. Her medical bills were covered. But I also knew that fighting Dennis required money I didn't have, energy I didn't have, and a body that was failing me in ways I couldn't explain. I could barely stand up without the room tilting sideways. I went to the quiet room and packed what I could carry. 2 shirts, a pair of work pants, my welding jacket that still smelled like the shop. At the bottom of my dresser, I found a photograph of Mama standing in the garden, holding a tomato so big she needed both hands. She was laughing. I put that photo in my jacket pocket. When I came back through the kitchen, Dennis had already opened the front door. Sheila was nowhere in sight. I stopped at the counter where Mama always kept a jar of cash for emergencies. There was $40 inside. I took it. Dennis watched me take it and said nothing. I walked to the door. My hand was on the screen when he spoke. "Walter." I turned. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Don't come back." The screen door closed behind me with a sound like a slap. Not loud, not violent, just flat and final. I stood on the porch where Mama used to sit in the evenings and watch the fireflies, and I understood that I'd just lost the last piece of her I had left. I walked. October in East Tennessee has a particular kind of cold. It's not the killing cold of deep winter, but it's the sneaky kind. The kind that waits until you stop moving and then settles into your joints like it's been invited. The streets of Knoxville looked different when you didn't belong anywhere in them. I'd lived here my entire life. 62 years. I knew these roads, these neighborhoods, these trees that turned red and gold every fall like they were showing off. But tonight everything felt borrowed. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I stopped at a gas station around 9 o'clock. My legs wouldn't carry me any further. I bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers for $3 and sat on the curb outside, eating slowly, trying to make each cracker last. A woman inside the station watched me through the glass. I could see her deciding whether I was dangerous or just pitiful. She decided on pitiful, apparently, because she came out a few minutes later with a styrofoam cup of coffee. "You look like you need this more than I do," she said. I thanked her. The coffee was bitter and too hot, and it was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in months. She went back inside without asking questions, which I appreciated more than the coffee itself. I sat there on that curb, sipping from the cup, watching cars pass on the highway, and I tried to think about what came next. My Social Security check went into an account that Dennis had helped me set up 2 years ago. He was listed as joint on the account. I had a sinking feeling I knew what that meant. I'd need to get to a bank tomorrow, get my own account set up, redirect the deposit. But tonight, right now, I had $37, a belly half full of gas station crackers, and nowhere to sleep. I ended up at a church, not inside, because it was locked, but under the awning by the back entrance, where they put out donation bins for old clothes. I found a blanket someone had left in one of the bins, musty but thick, and I wrapped myself in it and leaned against the wall. The concrete was cold through my pants. My back ached from walking. My hands were trembling again, that constant shake I couldn't control no matter how hard I tried. I slept, somehow. Not well, not deeply, but enough that when morning light hit my face, I was still alive, still breathing, still here. The church opened at 7. A woman named Mrs. Cahill found me sitting by the door, and instead of calling someone to remove me, she brought me inside and fed me eggs and toast from the kitchen where they prepared Sunday fellowship meals. She didn't ask where I'd come from. She didn't ask what had happened. She just put a plate in front of me and said, "Eat first, talk later." I ate. Then I talked. Not all of it. Just enough for her to understand that I needed a few days to figure things out. She told me I could come back each morning for breakfast, and that the Salvation Army on Magnolia Avenue served dinner at 5. She wrote the address on a napkin. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket next to Mama's photo. That afternoon, I walked to the bank. The teller confirmed what I'd feared. Dennis had already withdrawn the last Social Security deposit. He'd also changed the mailing address on the account to his own. I had $37 to my name and no income until I could get the redirect processed, which would take weeks. I spent 3 days like that. Breakfast at the church. Walking during the day because sitting still made me think too much. Dinner at the Salvation Army, where I ate meatloaf and green beans alongside men who'd been where I was for much longer. At night, I went back to the church awning with my blanket. Each night was colder than the last. Each morning, I woke stiffer, weaker, more aware that my body was running out of whatever it was running on. On the 4th day, I was walking along the edge of town where Knoxville thins out into farmland and the road narrows to 2 lanes. I wasn't heading anywhere specific. My feet just carried me east, away from the neighborhoods, away from the houses with their warm windows and their families inside. That was when I saw the bulletin board outside the county clerk's annex. A small corkboard nailed to a post, covered in notices about property taxes, water main repairs, community events, and near the bottom, one sheet of paper, handwritten in blue ink, county surplus auction, unclaimed property and structures. I read through the list. Most of it was junk. An acre of swampland, a pile of lumber from a demolished barn, rusted farm equipment, but at the very bottom, almost like an afterthought, storage shed with lot, south end of Claiborne Road, condition as is, minimum bid $12. I read it 4 times. $12. I had $37 left. I could buy this thing and still have enough for food for a week if I was careful. The rational part of my brain told me I was being foolish. A shed wasn't a house. A shed on the south end of Claiborne Road was probably a pile of rotted boards with a dirt floor. But the other part of my brain, the part that was tired of sleeping against church walls and eating charity food, that part whispered something different. That part said, at least it would be yours. The auction was the next morning. I showed up early. The room was small, smelled like old paper, had fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. Maybe 10 people were there, most of them regulars who bid on scrap and surplus as a hobby or a side business. Nobody looked at me. I was invisible, which I was getting used to. The auctioneer worked through the items quickly. The swampland sold for $8. The lumber went for $20. The farm equipment drew some interest. Then he reached the bottom of his list and paused, the way people pause before delivering a punchline. Storage shed with lot, he said. South end of Claiborne Road. Condition as is. Do I hear $12? Silence. A couple of the regulars glanced at each other and smirked. I raised my hand. $12, I said. The smirking stopped. A few people turned to look at me. I could feel their eyes measuring me, calculating, deciding I wasn't worth their attention. Sold, the auctioneer said, and brought his hand down on the table. I signed the papers. The clerk gave me a deed. I walked out of that building holding a piece of paper that said I owned something. It wasn't much. It was a shed on a forgotten road, but it was mine, and nobody could take it from me without my signature. It took me 2 hours to walk to Claiborne Road. When I finally saw the shed, I understood why nobody else had bid. It was roughly 12 feet by 16, built out of corrugated metal and wood framing that had warped with age. The roof was half collapsed on one side. The door hung from a single hinge. Inside, the floor was packed earth, hard but uneven. Spiderwebs thick as cotton candy covered every corner. There was a smell of rust and old motor oil, and something organic I didn't want to identify. But I pressed my hand against the wooden frame and felt something underneath the decay. The 2x4s were solid. Whoever had built this thing had used real lumber, heavy and dense, the kind that came from trees that had been growing for decades before they were cut. The metal panels, despite the rust, were thick gauge, industrial grade. This wasn't some backyard project. Someone had built this to store serious equipment, and they'd built it to last. I stood inside that shed, breathing dust, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Not hope. I'd been disappointed too many times for hope. But maybe the absence of despair, maybe the faintest suggestion that tomorrow didn't have to be exactly like today. I started working that same afternoon. I had no tools, nothing but my hands and whatever I could scavenge. I found a piece of rebar in the weeds outside and used it as a pry bar to remove the collapsed section of roofing. The metal fought me. My hands bled within the first hour. But 30 years of welding had given me hands that knew how to grip, how to twist, how to endure. I kept going back to the church for breakfast and the Salvation Army for dinner. Mrs. Cahill noticed the cuts on my hands and gave me a first aid kit. Without asking what I was doing, I didn't volunteer the information. Not yet. By the end of the first week, I'd cleared the interior, patched the worst of the roof using flattened tin cans and strips of tar paper I found at an illegal dump site half a mile away, and fashioned a door that actually closed. It wasn't pretty, It wasn't weather-tight, but it was mine, and I could sleep inside it without the wind hitting me directly. That was when Frank appeared. I was on the ground, trying to straighten a bent support beam when I heard boots crunching on gravel. I looked up and saw a man in his 70s, tall, lean, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from hickory wood. He wore overalls and a canvas jacket, and he was carrying a toolbox. "You're the one who bought Carter's old equipment shed," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Walter," I said. "Frank Dermott," he said. "I own the welding shop on 8th Street. Retired mostly." He looked at the shed, at the patches I'd made, at the rebar I was using as a tool. "You're a welder," he said. "I was," I said. 30 years. Frank nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. He set the toolbox down and opened it. Inside were proper tools: a hammer, pliers, a handsaw, a box of nails, a measuring tape. He also had a bag over his shoulder with what looked like wood scraps and metal brackets. "These have been sitting in my shop doing nothing," he said. "Figured they'd be more useful here." "I can't pay you," I said immediately. Frank looked at me with an expression that made me feel about 2 inches tall. "Did I ask you to?" We worked together that whole afternoon. Frank didn't talk much, but when he did, every word carried weight. He showed me how to reinforce the frame using cross-bracing, how to make the patched roof actually shed water instead of collecting it, how to seal the gaps between the metal panels using a mixture of caulk and tar he'd brought in a bucket. His hands were steady and precise. Mine shook, but less than they had been. Something about the work, about having purpose, seemed to quiet the tremor. Before he left that evening, Frank reached into his truck and pulled out a grocery bag. Bread, peanut butter, a jug of water, some canned beans, and a can opener. "You can't work if you don't eat," he said. "That's not charity. That's common sense." I ate peanut butter sandwiches that night sitting on the floor of my shed, and they tasted better than anything I'd eaten in years. Frank came back the next day, and the day after that. By the second week, we had a rhythm. He'd arrive around 8 with materials and coffee. We'd work until noon, break, then work until the light failed. He didn't ask about my past, and I didn't ask about his. We just built. It was during the 3rd week that Dennis found me. I was cutting a piece of wood when I heard a car engine that didn't belong on Claiborne Road. I looked up and saw Dennis's silver Lexus pulling up to the lot, looking absurd against the backdrop of farmland and rusted fences. He got out wearing his real estate blazer, the one he wore when he wanted people to think he was important. "Good God, Walter," he said, looking at the shed. "You're actually living in a tool shed. This is pathetic even for you. What do you want, Dennis?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "I need you to sign something. It's about Mama's estate. There are some complications with the probate, and my lawyer says I need your signature to move things forward." I took the paper. My hands were steadier than they'd been in weeks. The work had given them purpose. The document was a full transfer of my share of Mama's house to Dennis. There was already a signature on the primary line. My name, in my handwriting, except I'd never signed it. The forgery was nearly perfect. Every loop, every angle, but I'd been signing my name for 62 years, and I knew my own hand the way a musician knows their instrument. The pressure was wrong. My signature naturally pressed harder on the downstrokes. This one was uniform throughout. Someone had traced it, probably from the bank forms Dennis had access to. "I didn't sign this," I said. Dennis's smile didn't falter. "Of course you did. Last month, before you left. Don't you remember? You were so confused. Your health was bad. You probably just forgot." I held the paper and looked at my brother, and for the first time in years, a thought that had been growing in the dark corners of my mind finally stepped into the light. "Dennis," I said slowly, "when did my health start getting bad?" He blinked. "What?" "When did I start getting sick?" "Exactly when?" "I don't know, Walter. A year ago? 2 years? 4 years," I said. "Right around the time you moved into Mama's house. Right around the time you started making my coffee every morning." The color drained from his face. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but slowly, like watching a tide go out. "What are you talking about?" he said. But his voice had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something tight and controlled. I'm talking about the headaches, Dennis. The tremors, the fatigue, the blood work that never made sense. I'm talking about 4 years of feeling like I was dying by inches and no doctor could tell me why. You're crazy, Dennis said. You've always been paranoid. Maybe, I said. But I stopped getting sick the day you kicked me out. 3 weeks now, Dennis. 3 weeks since I had your coffee, your food, your water, and my hands have stopped shaking. My headaches are gone. I can think clearly for the first time in years. You want to explain that? Dennis stared at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind blew across the field, carrying the smell of dead leaves and cold earth. Then Dennis laughed. Not a real laugh, but the kind of sound people make when they're cornered and pretending they're not. You're insane, Walter. You always were. Mama knew it. Everyone knew it. Then you won't mind if I get my blood tested, I said. A proper toxicology screen this time, because the VA doctor I talked to yesterday said my symptoms are consistent with chronic heavy metal exposure, lead, specifically, and he said if I'd been ingesting it regularly for years, it would show up in my hair and nails even now. Dennis's jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. You have no proof of anything, he said quietly. Not yet, I said. But I will. Dennis folded the document and put it back in his jacket. His movements were careful, controlled, the way a man moves when he's keeping himself from doing something violent. You're making a mistake, he said. You should have just signed the paper. You should have taken the $40 and disappeared like you were supposed to. But you had to be stubborn. You had to be difficult. You always had to make things harder than they needed to be. He walked back to his car. Before he got in, he turned and looked at me one more time. That shed won't save you, Walter. Nothing's going to save you. Then he was gone. I stood there, holding the image of that forged signature in my mind. My brother's handwriting pretending to be mine. 4 years of poison disguised as morning coffee. And I understood with absolute clarity that I hadn't been sick. I'd been attacked. If you're still here, tell me something. Anything. Let me know I'm not talking into the dark. And if you were standing where I was, holding proof that your own blood had been slowly trying to kill you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. Quick note before we continue. The story ahead includes some details shaped for narrative impact. Some elements have been reimagined. If you need to take a break, I understand. But if you want to hear what the toxicology report revealed, stay with me. Frank was the one who drove me to the VA hospital for the blood work. He didn't ask why. He just showed up that morning, saw my face, and said, "Get in the truck." The results came back in 6 days. The doctor sat me down and spoke carefully, the way doctors speak when they're delivering news that's both medical and criminal. My lead levels were elevated. Not enough to kill me quickly, but enough to cause every symptom I'd been experiencing. Enough to cause permanent damage if it had continued. Enough to be consistent with chronic, deliberate exposure over a period of years. He asked me if I had any idea how lead had gotten into my system. I told him I had a very good idea. The police investigation started the following week. They tested the house on Elm Street. They found traces of lead acetate in the sugar bowl that sat on the kitchen counter, the same sugar bowl I'd used every morning in my coffee for 4 years. They also found a receipt in Dennis's desk drawer for a bulk purchase of lead acetate from an industrial supplier in Chattanooga. The receipt was dated 3.5 years ago. Dennis was arrested on a Tuesday. They charged him with aggravated assault with a deadly substance, attempted murder through prolonged poisoning, fraud, and forgery. Sheila was charged as an accessory. She broke down during questioning and admitted everything. It had been Dennis's plan from the start. Poison me slowly, have me declared incompetent, take the house, and cash out Mama's property, which was worth nearly $400,000. I didn't watch them get taken away. I heard about it from Frank, who heard it from the police officer who'd worked the case. She told Frank that in 20 years of law enforcement, she'd never seen a case of someone poisoning their own brother over real estate. That first night after the arrest, I sat in my shed and waited to feel something. Triumph. Maybe. Satisfaction. the hot glow of vindication, after years of being treated like I was worthless. But what I actually felt was a quietness, like the noise that had been running underneath my whole life had finally been turned off. Not happiness, not relief, just quiet. Frank came by the next morning with coffee. We sat on overturned buckets outside the shed and drank without talking for a long time. "Your mama," Frank said eventually. "She'd want you to know you did right." I thought about Mama's photograph in my pocket, her laughing face, the tomato she was so proud of. She'd always said the best things grow in the worst soil, and I'd never understood what she meant until now. Winter arrived properly in December. Tennessee cold isn't like northern cold. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one morning and sits on everything like a weight. The shed was better now. Frank and I had insulated it with salvaged fiberglass from a demolished building downtown. We'd installed a small wood-burning stove that Frank had been keeping in his shop for years. The roof was solid. The walls were sealed. The door closed properly and stayed closed. But December tested everything we'd built. The ice storm came on the 23rd. Not snow, but freezing rain. The kind that coats everything in glass and turns the world into something beautiful and lethal. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees. Power lines came down across half the county. Roads became impassable. I was stoking the stove around 10 that night when I heard something through the wall. Not the wind, not the cracking of ice-coated branches. Something human, a voice, thin and high, carried on the frozen air. I pulled on my jacket and opened the door. The world outside was glass. Every surface reflected the moonlight, creating an eerie glow that made the landscape look like something from another planet. And there, at the edge of the road, maybe 30 yards away, two figures. Small, too small. They were children. A girl, maybe 11, and a boy younger than her, maybe 8. They were holding hands and the girl was trying to pull the boy forward, but he'd stopped moving. His legs had simply given out. I moved faster than I'd moved in years. My boots slid on the ice and I went down hard on one knee, but I got back up and kept going. When I reached them, the girl looked at me with eyes so wide I could see white all around. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was in the place beyond fear, where the body simply operates on whatever's left. "Are you alone?" I shouted over the wind. She nodded. "Our car," she said. Her voice was so small I barely caught it. "Mama's in the car. She won't wake up." "Where?" I said. The girl pointed down the road. Maybe a quarter mile. I could barely see 20 feet in the ice. I picked up the boy. He weighed almost nothing. His jacket was thin, the kind of jacket you buy at a discount store because it's what you can afford, not because it's what you need. His skin was cold in a way that made my stomach drop. Not cool. Cold. Dangerously cold. "Come with me," I said to the girl. "Right now. Fast as you can." I carried the boy back to the shed. The girl followed, slipping on the ice, catching herself, keeping up through sheer willpower. Inside, I put the boy next to the stove and wrapped him in every blanket I had. The girl stood shaking by the door, staring at her brother like she was afraid to look away. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Elena," she said. "He's Marcus." "Elena, I need you to stay here with Marcus. Keep him warm. Keep talking to him. Can you do that?" She nodded. "Where are you going?" "To get your mama." The walk to the car nearly killed me. I'm not exaggerating. The ice was relentless. I fell 3 times. The third time, I hit my shoulder on something hard and felt a pop that sent white fire down my arm. But I kept going because there was a woman in a car somewhere ahead of me and 2 children behind me, and stopping wasn't something I was willing to do. I found the car nose first in a drainage ditch. The engine was dead. The woman inside was slumped against the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. Hypothermia. I could see it in the blue tint of her lips, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. I got the door open, which took everything my injured shoulder had left, and I pulled her out. She was heavier than I expected, dead weight, her body limp and unresponsive. I got her over my good shoulder and started walking back. That walk was the longest of my life. A quarter-mile of ice in 11-degree weather, carrying an unconscious woman with a shoulder that screamed every time I shifted her weight. I talked to her the whole way. I don't remember what I said. Probably nonsense. Probably the same kind of things you say to yourself in the dark when you're trying to convince yourself to take one more step. But I talked because talking meant breathing, and breathing meant I was still alive and still moving. The light from the shed stove was visible through the window from 100 yards away. That small orange glow in the darkness. A signal. A beacon. I got her inside. Elena was sitting exactly where I'd left her, holding Marcus's hand, whispering to him. When she saw her mother, she finally cried. Not the quiet tears of a child trying to be brave, but the deep, heaving sobs of a little girl who'd been holding everything together and could finally let go. I worked on the mother the way I'd seen medics work in training videos the VA used to show. Slow warming. Warm water on a cloth applied to the neck and chest. Blankets layered carefully. No sudden heat. Nothing that would shock the system. It took 2 hours before her eyes opened. She looked at me. She looked at her children. She looked at the shed, at the stove, at the blankets, at the small warm space that existed because a 62-year-old man had bought a pile of rusted metal for $12 and refused to let it stay broken. You saved us, she whispered. You saved yourselves, I said. You kept driving until you were close enough for your daughter to find help. Elena did the rest. But I knew what had happened. And I knew what would have happened if I hadn't heard them. 3 people frozen in a ditch, on a road nobody used in winter, found in spring, maybe not even then. They stayed for 4 days until the ice melted and the roads cleared. Elena's mother, whose name was Grace, told me she'd been driving from Memphis to her sister's house in Virginia when the storm caught them. She had $80 in her purse, no winter gear worth mentioning, and a car that hadn't been serviced in 2 years because money was something that happened to other people. Before they left, Marcus held my hand and said, "Your house is warm, Mr. Walter." It wasn't a house. It was a $12 shed on a forgotten road. But he was right. It was warm. And that was enough. Word spread the way it does in small communities. The man in the shed who'd pulled a family from an ice storm became a story people told, first as gossip, then as something closer to legend. Within 2 weeks, people I'd never met were showing up at my door. A retired electrician named James ran wiring from a utility pole and wouldn't take a dime. A woman named Patricia organized a collection at her church. A contractor named David brought his crew on a Saturday, and they framed out a proper addition in 8 hours. Materials appeared. Labor appeared. Help appeared from directions I'd never thought to look. By February, the shed had become something else entirely. 2 rooms, insulated walls, a real roof, running water from a well David's crew had dug, a wood stove that Frank had restored himself, piece by piece, in his shop. But more than the structure, something else had grown. People began stopping by, not to help build, but to sit, to talk, to bring a problem they didn't know how to carry alone. A man who'd lost his job, a woman whose husband had walked out, a teenager who'd been told by everyone in his life that he'd never amount to anything and was starting to believe it. I didn't have answers for them. I didn't have wisdom or advice or the kind of words that look good on motivational posters. I just had a warm room and a willingness to listen. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Frank noticed it before I did. "People keep coming here," he said one evening. "I know," I said. "I don't know why." Frank looked at me with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something gentler. "I do," he said. "It's the light." I didn't understand at first. Then he pointed to the window, where the glow from the stove was visible from the road, a small, steady light in the darkness. "People see that," Frank said, "and they know someone's home. Someone's awake. Someone gives a damn. In a world full of dark windows, that matters more than you think." One evening in March, I stood outside and looked at what my $12 shed had become. The walls weren't perfect. The roof had patches. The wood was second-hand, and the metal was salvaged, and nothing about it would make the cover of any magazine. But it was solid. It was warm. It was full of the kind of purpose that doesn't come from plans or ambitions, but from simply being willing to open your door when someone knocks. I thought about Dennis, sitting in a cell in the Knox County Jail. I thought about 4 years of lead in my coffee, 4 years of slow poison, 4 years of being systematically destroyed by someone who shared my blood. I thought about how close he'd come to succeeding, and I thought about the man I'd become. Not the victim Dennis had tried to create, but the man who now kept a light burning on a road where people sometimes got lost. The stove glowed. The night was cold but not cruel. Somewhere out there, someone was walking in the dark, looking for proof that warmth still existed, that kindness wasn't extinct, that one person's refusal to give up could mean the difference between despair and something better. I left the light on. Years later, people still talk about the place on Claiborne Road. They call it the Warm Room, which is funny because it started as a shed that couldn't keep out the wind. The details have grown in the retelling, the way stories do, but the core stays the same. A man who'd been poisoned by his own brother, cast out with $40 and a body that was slowly failing, chose to build instead of break. I still live here. I'm older now, slower. Frank passed away last spring, but his toolbox sits in the corner of the workshop, and every time I pick up his hammer, I feel his steady hands guiding mine. The community kept growing around this place. People come, people go. People come back years later with stories about how a warm room on a cold night changed the direction of their lives. I don't take credit for it. I just kept the stove going. So here's what I want to ask you. Not as a storyteller, but as a man who's lived this. What is your $12 shed? What is the broken, rusted, abandoned thing in your life that everyone else has written off? What is the thing that's been deemed worthless by the world, but still has solid bones underneath the decay? Maybe it's a relationship that fell apart. Maybe it's a dream you gave up on. Maybe it's your own sense of self, battered and poisoned by people who were supposed to love you. Maybe it's simply the belief that you deserve to take up space in this world. Whatever it is, that's your shed. And the question isn't whether it's worth saving. The question is whether you're willing to do the work. One board at a time, one nail at a time, one cold night at a time. Because the light you keep burning isn't just for you. It's for every person walking in the dark who needs proof that warmth is possible, that kindness is real, that someone, somewhere, gives a damn. Find your shed. Do the work. Keep the light on. Thank you for staying with me to the very end. Your presence meant more than you know. If this story touched something in you, share it in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell. Because these stories are more than stories. They're reminders that we matter. Every single one of us. One final note. The journey you've witnessed includes some elements reimagined for narrative depth and emotional impact. Some conversations have been reconstructed. Some details shaped for the telling. If this resonated with your heart, wonderful. If you need something different, that's okay too. Choose what serves you. God bless you all.